This is a map of the Sydney Rail Network, and this is a map of the Melbourne Rail Network. Together, they make up the most popular forms of transportation in the two biggest cities of the country down under, with 750,000 and 500,000 daily riders respectively. The public transportation in Australia as a whole is a bit weird. I mean, it's definitely a lot better than America's, but also a lot worse than most of Europe and Asia's, so it finds itself right in the middle. What's interesting about this though is that if you ask an American why a good public transportation system won't work in the US, many will say it's because of its large size and low population density. And yet, Australia is that, but even more so, but has ended up way better off. With a population of around 28 million people and a landmass of 7.7 million square kilometers, the country is 80% of the size of the US with just 8% of their population. So to understand how Australia has been able to find itself in between the US and Europe, we need to understand how all of Australia's public transportation works in unison. And the easiest way to do that is by splitting everything up by the capital city of each state, starting with Sydney in New South Wales, the most populated one. If we look back at a map of Sydney's public transportation, it's the rail network that carries everything the most, given how their metro is still so small, having only been opened in 2019 as the first metro in all of Australia. But that's the thing, the Sydney trains actually sort of function as their metro too, given it's used for intra-city transportation, similar to how the London Overground and Germany's S-Bahn works. There are 169 stations and 919 kilometers of track between its 9 lines, mainly functioning as the network that gets you from the suburbs into the Sydney Central Business District, or CBD for short, and back out again. It has a ridership of 270 million people annually. For the most part, it's, well, decently efficient. During peak hours, trains run every 5 to 10 minutes on most lines, while throughout the day it's usually every 15 minutes. It's not crazy fast, but it's also not their primary rapid rail system. That would be what comes next. See, the majority of Sydney trains usually end up passing through the two busiest stations in all of Australia, the Town Hall station, which is in the center of the Sydney CBD, and the Central station, located just a couple kilometers from it, which is the main station for all train interchanges, such as to the metro or light rail. Now, the beauty of Sydney and really all of Australia are the CBDs. Let me explain. Australian cities have much stronger employment centralization in their CBDs than most US cities, so their transit is designed to bring people into it. Whereas because of things like white flight, the US pioneered sprawling suburban office parks that pulled jobs far from the urban core. At the same time, Australia's population and economy simply weren't at the level to justify massive road projects across the country back then. So back to how this plays out in Sydney. Because their CBDs are so dense, they've had the ability to build out pretty great public transportation in it. Once you're able to take the Sydney train into it from the suburbs, that's where the metro and light rail take over. This is a map of the metro. It's quite literally one line as of now, the Northwest and Bankstown line, but it is 52 kilometers long, making it the third longest single driverless rapid transit line in the world, behind the Dubai Metro Red Line and Putrajaya Line in Malaysia. To some, it's almost an extension of the Sydney train system, but I'd rather approach it uniquely. Basically, the metro is the only rail service for some suburbs like the Hill District. While in suburbs with existing train stations, it can act as an express service, being a bit faster than the Sydney trains, with services running every 4 minutes during peak hours and 10 minutes off-peak. But another key purpose of it is to free up capacity on the existing Sydney trains network. Lines into the CBD, like the North Shore and Western Line or the Northern Line, frequently hit capacity limits, especially at choke points like the Harbour Bridge and City Circle tunnels. They get around 65 million riders annually as of 2025, which to some may actually be surprisingly low. But again, it's just one line. It won't be like this for too long either, because there are many things under construction. The Western Sydney Airport line that'll operate between St Mary's and Bradfield via the upcoming Western Sydney Airport, and the extension from Sydenham to Bankstown on the current line. Next, we have the light rail, with an annual ridership of 40 million people, equating to over 110,000 journeys per day. It basically helps reduce the problem of mobility within the CBD and inner city transportation. This is a map of it, or, well, almost all of it. These lines are just the ones that go into the CBD, but there's also the Parramatta line that opened at the end of 2024 too, essentially replacing the now closed Carlingford Railway line that ran from Clyde to Carlingford. Besides, it's getting to be known as Sydney's second CBD anyways. All in all though, the light rail has a fairly simple layout, containing 58 stations and 50 kilometers of track between its 4 lines. The crazy thing about it though is that it's the replacement for the Sydney trams that was shut down in 1961, which at one point was the second largest tram system in the entire world. But why that regrettably happened is a story for another day. Lastly, there are the buses, which fill in the gaps for what's not already addressed. They account for 42% of annual public transport, with an annual ridership of 230 million people, which makes it a very significant part of the public transportation network. The way it functions is that the Sydney bus network is divided into these 14 regions, and private bus operator companies bid to serve them. Since 2005, all new buses have been purchased by the government and leased to the operators. As a result, when regions have changed hands, all of the post-2005 built buses have remained with the region, with the older buses retained by the outgoing operators. There's a fleet of about 4,100 in operation today. There are commuter bus services like the Metro bus. There are the Sydney Olympic Park bus routes to bring people to the stadium, school buses, and much more. But the one I want to look at is the night ride. As you can kinda tell from the name, these are for the late nights. More specifically, they're a network of bus routes in operation between midnight and 4:30 a.m. The 16 lines allow for a nightly shutdown of the Sydney Trains suburban rail network and Sydney Metro. Now at this point, the one thing we haven't talked about is what the cost of all this is. I mean, public transportation needs to be affordable to make sense. The great thing is that all forms of public transportation in Sydney, down to even some of the ferries, use the Opal card ticketing system. It's all centralized. All modes except ferries offer separate peak period and off-peak fares. As you can see, it's priced in a sliding scale, going from every 10 kilometers to every 15 and to eventually just anything over 65. Whereas the bus is just 3, then another 5 kilometers, and anything over 8. Finally, there's weekly fare caps at $50, where everything else is free afterwards. Now the issue with this is, while that makes pricing good for intercity commuters who travel further, meaning they'll hit the fare cap quicker and have free travel for the majority of the week, it's expensive for short distance trips, since you pay the same amount if you travel 1 kilometer as someone who does 10 kilometers and will possibly not even hit the fare cap. It's reasons like this that make Sydney often rank in the most expensive cities in the world for public transportation, though the figures always differ. Now it's time to look at the next biggest city in Australia, Melbourne, which may actually soon become the biggest sometime in the next decade. And unlike Sydney, which grew more organically, Melbourne was actually planned from the start. It began with Robert Hoddle's street layout in 1837, known as the Hoddle Grid. Making up the modern-day CBD, it laid out unusually wide main streets and very large, regular square blocks, then later cut narrow little streets east-west through the middle of each block, so buildings could be accessed from the back for commercial activity and waste. Rather than narrowing the main streets, these laneways were carved out of the blocks themselves, a practical compromise that ended up creating the dense laneway system Melbourne is famous for today. And because the city streets were so wide and straight, it eventually led to the perfect space for trams. Just like Sydney, Melbourne built an extensive tram system, but unlike Sydney, they ended up keeping it. Long story short, a man named Robert Risson, chairman of the Melbourne and Metropolitan Tramways Board from 1949 to 1970, heavily defended trams. And by the time he stepped down, opposition parties were finally starting to see it was the right decision. That's why if we look at a map of the Melbourne trams today, it's extremely expensive. In fact, with 500 trams, 250 kilometers of track, 24 routes, and around 1,700 stops, it's the largest operational urban tram network in the entire world. For comparison, Toronto's streetcar network, often cited as North America's largest, has just 83 kilometers of track. While trams have become part of Melbourne's city culture, they aren't just a novelty or a tourist attraction. They're genuine transportation infrastructure, carrying over 150 million passengers annually. They fill the gap between the suburban trains and walking, primarily around the inner suburbs and CBD area, which, by the way, is part of the free tram zone along with the Docklands, meaning that the trams are actually free in this area. But trams only really cover the inner city. To get people from the outer suburbs into the CBD in the first place, that's where the railway comes in. If we're to look back at a map of Melbourne's railways, it basically functions like their metro too, but it definitely bridges the gap between getting people from the outer suburbs into the CBD in the first place. With 227 stations and 430 kilometers of track between its 16 lines, it's the biggest railway system in Australia and second busiest in the country, with 182 million rides annually. It's all overground though. It was only still fairly recently in February 2026 when Melbourne's first true underground rail corridor became fully operational, the Metro Tunnel, running between South Kensington and South Yarra with 5 new underground stations beneath the Hoddle grid. The tunnel links the extremely busy Cranbourne and Pakenham lines with the Sunbury line, creating a new high-frequency cross-city service that runs independently of the existing CBD tracks. Crucially, this new corridor bypasses the extremely busy Flinders Street station and City Loop, removing an entire group of services from the inner city rail bottleneck. Put simply, by taking these trains off the City Loop, this increases frequency and frees up track capacity across all the lines on the rest of the network as well. And finally, there are the buses, which serve over 100 million people annually through their network. While they seem kind of redundant given there are trams, they do have their own important role too, primarily servicing the outer suburbs of Melbourne and providing the feeder into the tram and rail network. There are around 400 routes in operation they do this through, operated by privately owned bus companies under franchise from the Victoria State Government. All of these services have a role in servicing the night network, which is perhaps the most comprehensive weekend overnight transportation system of all the Australian cities. It started as a 12-month trial in 2016 before being made permanent a year later. It comprises all of Melbourne's regular electric railway lines, 6 tram lines, 21 night bus services, and 5 regional coach services. As for how payments work, Melbourne has a fully integrated ticketing system across all modes of public transport in the metropolitan area through the MyKey Smart Card. But it's still not that simple. Fares are calculated based on 2 zones, at least while we're talking about strictly metropolitan Melbourne here. There's Zone 1 covering the CBD and inner suburbs, and Zone 2 covering the outer suburbs. But there's also a Zone 1+2 fare, which simply covers the entire area. There are a lot of different ways you can pay, which is nice. There's a 2-hour unlimited option, daily option, weekly option, and the yearly one is heavily discounted. The next city we'll be looking at is Brisbane, the 3rd largest city in Australia. It's a pretty complex city for public transportation given how much urban sprawl there is. In fact, there's actually a need to increase density so public transportation can become viable here. Just look at its density compared to other major cities in Australia. Like Sydney, they also tore down an incredibly extensive tram network in the 60s, which at one point was carrying 160 million passengers a year. Though for me, the funniest thing about their public transportation is the Brisbane Metro, which isn't really a metro at all. Despite its name, it's a more high-capacity, high-frequency public bus rapid transit system. And just to be clear, this isn't the type of bus system that operates on the main roads that we all see while driving, but it's a completely grade-separated system made exclusively of bus-only roads. There's a fleet of just 50 electric, bi-articulated, or as I prefer to say, double-bendy buses that can carry 150 passengers at a time. They operate on just 2 lines between 21 kilometers of track with 18 stations along the way. Where this gets interesting though is, while we just talked about the Brisbane Metro being a bus rapid transit system, it's actually not even the main bus network in Brisbane. There's an even broader one, the TransLink bus network. Yeah, this is a city of buses basically. This network is a lot more extensive, comprising over 400 routes and 10,000 stations, carrying over 70 million passengers annually. Where it differs in purpose from the Brisbane Metro is like this. The TransLink bus network provides, or at least attempts to provide, comprehensive coverage across Brisbane into the suburbs, like a spider web, whereas the Brisbane Metro focuses only on routes along major corridors with higher frequency. It's similar to the differences between the Sydney trains and the Sydney Metro, except with buses. The TransLink bus network still does provide inner city services though, like you can see here, and the City Loop buses give you free rides all around the CBD. There is still a rail network in Brisbane though, known as the Queensland Rail. This is a map of it, extending all the way to the Gold and Sunshine coasts, which are fully integrated into the network. There are 12 lines and 152 stations, with an annual ridership of 43 million passengers a year, which is low for a railway network. But it's really just meant for longer trips from outer suburbs and satellite cities into the CBD. So the trains bring you in, the bus takes you into the CBD, and the metro bus handles the inner city transport at high frequencies. The payments are also centralized, with all forms of public transportation being able to be paid with a Go card. The prices are extremely simple too, because the zonal system was eliminated in favor of a flat 50-cent per journey fare after a trial period in 2024. So it is extremely cheap, to say the least. The next city we'll be looking at is Perth, since we're clearly just going by descending population in this video. But don't let this fool you though, because Perth's public transportation is actually quite decent, especially given how spread out the city is. It's all provided by TransPerth, managed by the Public Transport Authority, a state government organization. The TransPerth train system consists of these 8 lines, with 86 stations and 244 kilometers of track. Uniquely, a large portion of the system runs in the median of freeways, which in my eyes is actually an interesting thing. Freeways are typically long and straightish, which is perfect for trains to run on, and centralizes the noise pollution to a single corridor where there's already noise. Though the downside of this approach is that the stops aren't directly accessible from residential zones. With 62 million riders annually, it's the 3rd busiest suburban railway network, despite being the 4th largest city in Australia, a testament to its efficiency. The bus system, meanwhile, has 55 stations, 42 of which are bus-train interchanges. These interchanges act as collectors, pulling passengers in from both sides of the highway and stitching together suburbs that would otherwise be cut off from the railway line. They operate every 10 to 20 minutes in peak times and every 30 to 60 minutes off-peak on weekdays, through their fleet of over 1,500 buses, and they have an annual ridership of 82 million. There's a ferry system too, but what I really want to talk about is their fare system, since this is where they really shine in my opinion. Let me explain. Through the ticketing system SmartRider, which makes up almost 80% of all Perth's public transport fares, students get to travel for free Monday through Friday, while everyone gets it for free on Sundays. While in the Perth CBD, there's a free transit zone, making it free travel on buses and trains all the time. This is all insane, in a good way of course. Even just the daily rate though, if you don't have the SmartRider card, is cheap too. But the real problem with the Perth system is there's no radial route. If we're to look back at a map of their metro, if they could complete the circle, so to say, it would mean all the lines wouldn't have to change at the CBD, since that makes a lot of traveling extremely inefficient with the system today. And yes, Perth got rid of their tram system just like Sydney and Brisbane, but they did it even earlier, in 1958. Lastly, there's Adelaide. And I say lastly because honestly, Hobart is just too small to cover relative to the other capital cities. There's basically just buses anyways. But moving on, Adelaide is, well, almost all buses too. There's the Adelaide Metro, which actually isn't a metro, but rather the brand under which the South Australian Department for Infrastructure and Transport manages the public transport system of Adelaide. Statistically, the city has always been behind the rest of the mainland capitals when it comes to public transportation. According to a study conducted by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Adelaide has the highest passenger vehicle travel to work, 84%, and the second lowest proportion of people walking to work, 2.9%. While at the same time, those who do take it, the average amount of time people spend commuting to and from work is 65 minutes, and the wait time is on average 11 minutes. And finally, until 2014, Adelaide was the last mainland capital with a non-electric rail network. But Adelaide still does have some stuff going for it, and it's still better than most US cities if we're being honest. Their suburban rail has 7 lines and 89 stations, mainly just for transporting people from the suburbs to the CBD, but it's their buses that really shine. It's the most extensive service provided in the city. The most used route of the Adelaide Metro is the Oban guided busway, going from the CBD to Modbury. It's the world's fastest and until 2011, the world's longest guided busway, with a maximum permitted speed of 100 kilometers an hour and a length of 12 kilometers. It's the only guided busway in all of Australia, and there are very few of them in the world even. Part of their bus fleet is also the Tindo bus, the world's first solar-powered bus, operational since 2007. It's one of the few bus routes that is actually completely free around the CBD. But according to the South Australia's Transport Strategy 2025 files, In 2022, 20% of buses were early and 10% were late, meaning only 70% were on time, which really isn't great, so it's something to work on. Finally, just like every Australian city besides Melbourne, Adelaide tore down their extensive tram network. But there is one line that survived the closures, the Glenelg line, and it's also free in the city centre. In the end, I'd say Australia sits in the middle of the global public transport spectrum, not by accident, but by design. Its cities are too spread out for European-style metros everywhere, yet dense enough in their cores to support serious rail, tram, and bus networks when they're integrated properly. The result isn't perfect, and there's definitely some high car ownership in some cities, but it's proof that geography isn't destiny, and that good public transport is less about copying models and more about building systems that actually fit the cities they serve. Thank you for watching.